You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Keri Wong. I'm an assistant professor here at the IOE. In this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Dr. Lynne Rogers. Lynne is Reader in Education at UCL Institute of Education and co-director of the Center for Post-14 Education and Work. Lynne has long-standing interests in teacher and lecturer training and learning in further and higher education and other professional settings. Currently, she is the academic head of research engagement and impact. Previously, she was the faculty director of teaching and learning, in addition to leading the Masters in Teaching and Learning in Higher and Professional Education. She was also director of the London Centre for Excellence in Teacher Training. As director, Lynne had overall responsibility for all research and development projects, all of which concern curriculum development for initial teacher education for the lifelong learning sector. She has extensive experience in education as a teacher and in a range of management positions prior to becoming an academic. Lynne has undertaken research and published on adolescents' behavior in school, studying and homework, and music education. In particular, her book on disengagement from education focused on the experiences of young people aged 11 to 19 across a range of contexts, including secondary, further education, young offender institutions, and alternative provisions, which may all be of interest to our listeners. Although Lynne and I lecture on the same module together, Criminal Journeys, we don't really have that much time to catch up. So I'm very excited to chat with Lynne today, not just about her journey as a teacher and academic, but her views on curriculum offerings and assessments for young people of varying levels of attainment, educational trajectories and transitions, and the education and policy impact of her work. Hello, Lynne. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Keri. Great to be talking with you this afternoon.
Wonderful to have you. I guess first off, I'll start with the question of, beginning of your academic career, you were a secondary school teacher. Is this where your interest in 14 and 19-year-olds originated?
Absolutely. I was, as a young person, I studied music at university and was really enthralled by being able to spend my life initially as a music teacher in a school. And what was so interesting about that at the time, the GCSE curriculum had just come in and the music syllabus had moved to a very sort of dynamic, student-centred, exploratory way of thinking about music. So young people were encouraged to compose their own pieces of music. We did lots of performances. And I found it quite exhilarating as a young teacher. This was really student-centred and student-led. And my role in part was a facilitator. But what struck me at that time was that some young people could be very doubtful of their own ability, even when they clearly had lots of potential. And I worked particularly hard to foster a sort of shared music environment where everybody could participate. And it struck me that it was really important to enable young people to develop and conceptualize themselves as having an identity as a learner. And that relates to not just the time that they're in schools, but shaping their future adult life as they move into further study and education and work. And it seemed to me that the decision-making processes for some of the young people was very, very challenging. And also it was at a time of adolescence. But I remained convinced of the remarkable character and qualities of young people. And it was something that just stayed with me for a long time and that caused me to think a great deal.
Were there any other kind of pivotal moments in your career that influenced the research that you do?
While I was studying for my PhD, I was very fortunate to be able to become and take on the role of a research assistant for a number of programs. And at that time, one of the first programs that I worked on was an evaluation of the behaviour improvement program for the Department for Education. And this was really involved me going around the country interviewing teachers, students from a collection of local authorities and primary schools and secondary schools, just understanding the interventions that they'd put in place as part of the programme, and to see how across the local authorities that were involved, how these benefited or enabled young people to progress. And I still remember with incredible clarity talking to this one young person who was in year 9, and he'd just been permanently excluded from the school that he was in, and the school was hoping to find him a place at a local further education college. And I was just having a conversation with him, and he was talking about he did a newspaper round in the morning, and listeners now must remember that this was quite a long time ago when newspaper, people got up very early in the morning in all weathers and delivered papers through your letterbox. And it struck me that that was a very responsible thing to be doing, and clearly required organisation, management, and an ability to sort of get organised and be prepared to go out in all weathers. And I found myself being quite puzzled as to why this young man had been permanently excluded. And on asking him about this, he explained that he'd missed a little bit of schooling and had come back into school for an English lesson. In his words, they were reading a book that was just too difficult for him to read. And the incident that he relayed was that in this one lesson, the teacher asked him to stand up and read out loud from the book. And he looked at me and said, I just simply couldn't do this. I know I can't read those words. It's just too hard. And I was faced with a choice. Do I stand up and make a complete fool of myself in front of all my friends? Or do I kick off? And he did the latter. And the disruption he caused meant that he was permanently excluded. And it seemed to me that, I'm not criticising the institution, but there must be better ways of thinking about education so that young people don't have experiences like that are with them for the rest of their lives. So for me, looking at young people who are disengaged or perhaps struggling a little bit in education has become a real focus of the work that I do, because I'm a great believer in the affordances of education and the empowerment it brings to young people.
Mm-hmm. That's a really powerful story. Thanks for sharing that, Lynn. I mean, it's great that the young person felt comfortable enough to share that with you as well. So I guess, is this how, you began to then focus on young people aged 14 to 19-year-olds? What is special about this age group, and what are some issues that you have encountered?
I think one of the things that makes it very interesting to me is that this age range crosses both school and further education. And I've been involved in schools and further education, so have an understanding of how both of these systems work, how they're quite different organisations, not in terms of size, but also the range of qualifications that are offered and so on. And quite often, I think that people either sort of focus on schools or they focus on further education. And for me, there's something about the nexus between these two types of educational institutions that's really important to think about to enable young people to progress. So, Keri, if I give you an illustration of the importance of trying to think more about how schools and further education work collaboratively, I'll talk a little bit about the report that I worked on with colleagues from Mime Consulting, the post-16 trajectories report. And my role within this research was to undertake qualitative research, a mixture of individual interviews and focus groups with young people in schools and sixth form colleges and further education. The specific remit was to talk to young people who were on a 3-year study programme. I'll explain that now. When students finish their GCSE course at Key Stage 4, they then, at sixth form level, they undertake what's called a study programme, and generally that lasts for 2 years. But quite a number of young people take 3 years to do that. And that's often because they haven't attained a high enough level of GCSE attainment that enables them to move straight on from GCSEs, which are at level 2, to BTEC qualifications or A-levels at level 3. So this is a group of young people who need some special care and attention, but also need real support in enabling them to progress their studies. So within London, for instance, what we found in terms of the research, that about 30% of London students move to a 3-year level 2 programme because they can't do it in 2 years because they haven't done sufficient qualifications before. And in terms of the analysis that we did, the reasons for this were because they hadn't done sufficiently well at GCSE, perhaps particularly not in maths and English. So they moved to a further education college and did 1 year of level 2, followed by 2 years of level 3. Some students switched courses from A-levels to BTECs, and some switched vocational courses. The issue here is that many of the students I spoke to had fully anticipated being able to stay on at school or move to a sixth form college. And what they found, that when their results were slightly disappointing, that the school didn't want them to stay at school. And they were told that there was no place for them at the school. And then they needed to find a place in further education. So this relationship between schools and further education is incredibly important in looking at, but also in enabling young people to progress. And, within that, the young people themselves, they flourished in further education. I'm not saying they wouldn't have flourished in the school environment, but that wasn't on offer for them. And they enjoyed the sort of greater freedom, they enjoyed a different sort of environment, but they also talked quite a lot about the poor quality of narrow careers education, information advice and guidance. They talked about the pressures that they were under in terms of GCSEs, and they talked also about how vocational provision seemed to be undervalued. Again, this issue is a hugely important issue, and it's a long-standing issue in England, where there's always been a sense that academic A-levels are the gold standard and vocational education is second best. And it's something that we all need to think about and move forward. But what this illustrates is that enabling young people to make the right choices is absolutely central to successful transitions to further education or higher education or work. And we also know that quite a number of young people choose the wrong subjects, or they weren't what they were anticipated.
Mm-hmm. I remember just listening to all the stories you were saying just now, Lynn, reminds me of me having troubles choosing my GCSE subjects as well. So I guess maybe exploring that a little further. Do you think that we still need GCSEs, or maybe you might have other suggestions on how this can be improved?
That's a really tricky question, Keri. I think what we have to remember is that the raising of the participation age means that all young people have to be in education, training, or some sort of form of apprenticeship or employment up to the age of 18. And when GCSEs were first introduced, the school leaving age was age 16. So certainly amongst some colleagues and other organisations that I've been talking to over the last few years, questions are being raised about, do we still need GCSEs? What happens at the moment is that GCSEs at age 16 absolutely pivotal to the direction of travel that a young person might follow. But at the same time, there's a question of, is it necessary at that point? Because people are going to remain in education up until 19. Why couldn't it be a more light touch checkpoint? Does it have to be this is absolutely critical moment? And I think alongside that are debates about the breadth of the curriculum offer, which seems rather narrow in this country compared to many others. The sense of the greater importance of wider skills and employability, and also thinking about this broader view of education when some of it is also about promoting active citizenship and enabling young people to think about their place within society. So we have tensions at the moment between a system that focuses very much on exams, which historically have tended to reward repetition of knowledge or rote learning, with a society and employers who demand very, very different skill sets in terms of much wider skills related to communication, resilience, problem solving, innovation, creativity. So I think at the moment there are some conversations to be had thinking about what is the purpose of education and what offer is it that will enable young people to develop as themselves and also enable them to progress in their future careers.
Yes, and I think those are definitely big and important questions that, especially at this time, we should be considering and perhaps rethinking. And on that note, what are your thoughts in terms of the assessments that we currently have? Do you think we need to rethink those as well?
I do. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I mean, we haven't touched on the pandemic yet, but even before this very difficult situation in which we find ourselves, there was a growing sense that the international challenges to be faced in the 21st century require that students need to develop a wider range of skills and attributes than in previous generations. It's also clear that the divergence of work opportunities, career opportunities, different occupations that you and I can't even think of, mean that young people are going to, of necessity, have multiple careers in the demanding sort of different skills. So you have to question whether exams are the right answer as the sole method of assessing learning. So these types of conventional assessment approaches do seem to encourage students to adopt a surface approach. often reliant on rote learning and memorization, rather than thinking about how knowledge or conceptual learning is applied in different settings. I remember from the days when I was a school teacher, and the students used to say to me, is this important? And occasionally it was important. I'll give you an example from IT. One of the only bits of real learning in terms of rote learning that I ever felt that students needed to do was to learn the Data Protection Act. That has subsequently been changed, but there are a whole number of statements related to the Data Protection Act. And the students knew that they just had to learn them. Now, the challenge from my point was to think about, well, how do I make that meaningful? How do I apply that to different situations? But there's a danger when students think they're going to be assessed on things, that they just learn the facts without any sort of internalization. And the other challenge with exams is that teachers also tend to teach to the test. So the curriculum gets narrower. Students often ask, is this going to be in the exam? Do I need to learn it or not? And these findings have been demonstrated in a wealth of literature. So especially as we come out of, or when we come out of the pandemic, I think there's a real opportunity here to be doing some thinking about different ways of conceptualizing teaching and learning, be that around the use of digital technologies, or thinking much more clearly about transferable skills and how these are mapped into the curriculum offer that young people have. Certainly, there's a wealth of research coming out. For instance, Sutton Trust released a report only the other week that was highlighting in a very disturbing way the divergence of increasing inequalities between those who attend perhaps the independent schools or successful secondary schools and those who are in poorer communities. So there are big questions, I think, coming out of the pandemic.
Yes, definitely. And perhaps many other new opportunities as well in being more creative and thinking about our teaching and also learning for our students as well. On that note, perhaps do you think that the research that's coming out of the IOE right now is making an impact post-pandemic recovery and whatnot as well?
I sincerely believe it is. What, in my engagement and impact role, what I've been incredibly impressed by is the immense amount of research that IOE has done during the pandemic that's looking to support and offer resources and guidance to educationalists, those working in social policy. For instance, Gemma Moss and her colleagues have done really exciting work with primary school teachers, looking at the way the diverse roles that primary schools play in their communities and thinking about educational priorities. We've had Keri, you've been doing some really interesting work looking at the short and long-term effects of COVID-19 on individuals' social trust and relationships, mental and physical health. And we've also had really important contributions made about the role of teaching and classroom assistants during the COVID crisis. These are just a few examples, but sort of underpin the positioning of research within the Institute of Education, which has always been centred around social justice and also engaging with a whole range of stakeholders so that research has value and is used as soon as we can convey new findings. So a very sort of dynamic sharing perspective to thinking about research. So we have resources for parents and teachers. We write policy briefs. We're recording these podcasts, which I hope people are listening to and finding them of interest. But I think collectively, this research does demonstrate the power of education and social science research. And I have every belief research of this nature is going to be incredibly important as we move through and come out of the pandemic.
Yes, I must agree with you, Lynn, there that the IOE has been bustling with activity, I would say, since the pandemic, if not even before that. And we're really all very glad that we can contribute and play our part in all of this as well. Lynn, it has been really interesting talking with you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast and sharing your work. We wish you well with your research. You can follow Lynn on Twitter at UCL14E, and you can learn more about her research via the links in the episode notes. We've had some fascinating guests on the podcast, a real variation in topics and expertise across the social sciences and education. Search for IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts, and to find episodes from seasons 1 to 7 of Research for the Real World, as well as other IOE podcasts. And if it's a musical interlude you're after, there's a Spotify playlist too, featuring songs chosen by our guests and the IOE podcast team. All of that is accessible on our website. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Keri. See you next time.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.